looking at the data and realizing no human being ever had actually seen that feeling of knowing, oh my God, like I'm the first person to actually see this data, interpret it, and then understand it so that other people can understand it. It's like a drug almost.
Dennis, could you tell us what brought you to the field of fusion?
Yeah, actually, it dates back to, if you can believe it, when we had paper newspapers, and I grew up in rural Saskatchewan, Canada, but there was a provincial newspaper, and put in, for some reason, in the same place where the comics were, like Snoopy and things like this. It was Ripley's Believe It or Not, and it was my first introduction to fusion. I was like 15 or 16 years old, and they had this classic graphic of fusion. Did you know that there's an energy source called fusion, that if you took this bottle of water and you converted its energy through fusion, it would be the equivalent to 100 barrels of oil? And I'm looking at this, is this real? Is it real? And so that was my first introduction to fusion. I actually remember it, right? And I thought, that is amazing. And I asked my high school teacher if I could write my term paper that was in physics. I think it was probably 11th grade, so it was like 16 years old, something like that. And could I do it on fusion? And I scoured libraries and things to try to find, no internet, right? To try to find information on it, and I wrote up on that, and I actually have the paper in my home, still in my closet at my home. It was I got an A on the paper, but I'll always remember the comment from the teacher. It was a great job on this, Dennis, but this just looks too complicated. That was which I have to say was excellent foreshadowing of the things that I have ended up working on in my career, which is trying in some sense to uncomplicate it a little bit.
What was like the first textbook or your favorite textbook that kind of got you deeper into the subject?
Yeah, actually, it was interesting. I kind of lost. While that was interesting, I went to school in engineering physics in Canada, in the University of Saskatchewan, and I kind of accidentally came back into and got an interest in fusion. Was because there was a significant amount of study going on, particularly because of aurora borealis studies, aurora studies, which are essentially plasma studies. And I took a class that had to do with basics of plasma science, but it also covered fusion. I don't think it was even a textbook. I had an awesome professor in that, and started reading on it, started actually doing real work on it rather than just superficial looks at it. And I just got totally fascinated by the field. There's a few textbooks that kind of cover it. There's one by Chen from UCLA. That's usually a pretty accessible book, just because it has fairly simple math in it, and it goes through the key concepts in plasma physics. But it's interesting, actually, fusion itself there's a book by my colleague Jeffrey Freiberg, but he only wrote it a few years ago, which tried to cover more of the concepts in fusion energy. It tended to not be, honestly, a very accessible subject matter. Fusion, I mean, right? So you could find things on plasmas, but fusion, it tended to be very pretty complex introductions into the field, almost solely meant for graduate students, not for undergraduates. Yeah. One of my ideas is actually at some point to sit down and write a textbook which is accessible at the junior and senior level for STEM students. And myself and my colleague, Zach Hartwig at MIT, and a few others as well too, we've actually put together an undergraduate course which tended to be rare itself, actually, in fusion, and going through the primary concepts. So anybody's basically nuclear engineering, physics, any kind of STEM discipline would be able to get through it. Yeah, but it doesn't exist yet.
When you were studying plasma, were you really scared by the numbers which are required for the fusion reactions? For example, the temperatures, it's like in the order of, what is it, 100 or 10 million?
100,000 C.
100 million. Million, right?
100 million,
Oh,
no,
100
100
million,
million Celsius, yeah. Let's use scientific use, 100 million Kelvin. Well, no, because actually the energies which are involved are actually very small. I mean, the moment you start looking at anything in nuclear science, it's like everything's that's actually how we know almost everything about nuclear science. You start building accelerators, which start at around 100 kilovolts for a fundamental charged particle. That means energies of around 100 keV. The first classes of accelerators were there up into the MeV range, so about 1,000,000 electron volts. That you can build that actually. In fact, we have one where undergraduate students build something called a fusor, which is essentially a small internal accelerator effectively through a grid that's around those. And you can make fusion actually reactions with that. In fact, we had a student who came in and him and his twin brother actually built one of those when they're in high school. So the energies involved are actually not that hard to imagine, because 100,000 volt, a couple 100,000 volt accelerator you can put together.
It's essentially, it's the lack of the slow particles that makes the temperature so high. That's essentially what's going on.
Bingo. This is what's confusing often about fusion, is that people go, oh my God, it's so energy. It's like the energies involved, we've accessed those since the days of modern accelerators, since the 1930s. The difficulty is Coulomb collisions. Is that the way to accelerate particles to those energies, and that's literally why we use that unit, right? We use electron volts, which is basically just the energy which is gained by a fundamental charged particle over that number of volts. So if you look at the peak and the cross section for DT fusion, which is the most easily triggered fusion of those reactions, it peaks at around 100 keV, 100,000 electron volts. And so you take that and you put it into, it's one of the first things you teach students, right? You take that, you put it into, let's say we do it with deuterons, and then you'd have a triated target, which just means it's filled with tritium in some way. And you basically hit this, you accelerate that, hit it into the target. It's like you will make fusion reactions, DT fusion reactions, because it's at a sufficiently high energy that it can overcome the Coulomb barrier and trigger the nuclear reaction. The difficulty is the Coulomb collisions, because you're accelerating a charged particle, it comes into solid matter, and what it starts doing is it undergoes collective Coulomb collisions, particularly with the electrons, and the electrons are at room temperature. And what this means is that you can calculate the rate of energy transfer that happens between this incoming particle and the electrons. And what that ends up is just heat, because you're just collectively exciting all the charged particles in the solid matter. And approximately you get something like 1 in every 10,000. So what that tells you is the rate that the incident deuteron slows down. And then you can calculate also the rate, what's the probability per unit time of the fusion reaction occurring. And what you find out is that for every particle, you have to put about 7,000 or 8,000 deuterons into the target to trigger one fusion reaction. But you spent 100 kilovolts of energy already accelerating it, and the energy gain is 10 MeV, so it's about 100 times that. So you're doomed. You cannot make net energy systems by just simply triggering fusion reactions. And it's all because of Coulomb collisions. So Coulomb collisions happen, right? The collective effect which is going on of this particle interacting in the so-called over Debye lengths. And so the immediate and in fact, you can go back and even normalize this and say, what if it even wasn't at room temperature? What if in fact you allow the background medium to have arbitrary temperature? So then you do that, and what happens is, it's a feature of Coulomb collisions, is that Coulomb collision frequency decreases as energy. Mm-hmm. So this is the other quick calculation you do, which is very counterintuitive at the beginning, but you calculate this, and the reason is because when particles are interacting through Coulomb collisions rather than essentially like solid sphere collision model, it's an action at a distance, and almost all of the exchange of forces happens at the closest distance of approach. So if particles are going faster, they basically spend less time in the strong part of the Coulomb proportional or attractive field, and therefore as they go faster, they actually interact less with each other, not more, which is very counterintuitive. But you actually go through that, you can calculate that, and then you say, oh, well, let's imagine now it's not room temperature, it's rather a temperature, an ensemble temperature up at temperatures like 10 keV. By the way, the translation is 1 electron volt is approximately 11,600 Kelvin. This is why we always just multiply by 10,000 and then you roughly get the temperature in SI units. 1 electron volt is about 10,000 Celsius. That's roughly where ionization occurs. And so the numbers I'm talking about of 10,000 10 keV, that's 100 million degrees Celsius. That's where the conversion comes from. Anyway, so you actually go up to temperatures like 10 keV or 100 keV, and you calculate, even if you allow the particles to be super fast so they collide less, it turns out Coulomb collisions are still hundreds of times more. And what I mean by that is that the exchange of momentum and energy is hundreds of times faster than what you can get from the energetics that you get from the fusion reaction, basically the probabilities. The relative cross sections of Coulomb collisions, which are essentially the scattering collisions in any medium like this, are always way, way bigger than the fusion reactions. So what does that mean? Conceptually, very important, is that it means you must allow the collisions to occur because you can't avoid them. It's physically impossible. And when you let lots and lots of collisions occur in a closed system, then it becomes a temperature. It's not an energy. And this is the key thing. By the way, we do a horrible job of teaching the difference between energy and temperature. They're absolutely totally different things. And what that means is that, in fact, they are different things because temperature is only defined through thermodynamics. Yes, yeah, right. So it has to do with energy, but it's actually a different concept. Anyway, so in the end, that's actually why you get to the point where you must have a temperature. That's what we call thermonuclear fusion. Just fusion is easy to occur out of thermal equilibrium. It must be in thermal equilibrium, and you must have a temperature. Thus is the requirement for energy or confinement. Because if it's a temperature, this means it must be isolated from the laws of thermodynamics. It can't be in direct contact with something that is actually a much lower temperature, or otherwise it will transfer all of its heat into that. Thus, this is when you see about fusion, you go, what is the hard thing? You ask this question, what's the hard thing about 100 million degrees? The hard part is not the average energy of the particles. The hard part is keeping it thermally isolated from the terrestrial environment.
So what you're saying is actually that if these things were tuned a little bit different, if the losses were lower and the energy of the deuteron-tritium reaction was a little higher, it might have actually been very easy to do fusion, like net energy fusion. We just live in a universe where it's not easy. That's
You live in a universe where there's only one place naturally that has fusion energy gain, is in the center of stars for exactly that reason. Yeah. But it is cool to think about that. You can actually go and say, what would a fusion reaction look like that would actually get you to net energy? And it is about that. If the cross section was like 100 times larger than what it is right now, then you're right on the precipice of in fact just being able to get energy out of the system like that with just a simple accelerator, and we would have fusion. It's approximately that, right? By the way, we have a name for that. You know what it's called? Fission. Because the deuterium-tritium is an amazing nuclear reaction. It has a peak cross-section of about 5 barn. Typical nuclear scattering collisions are about 1 barn. It's a really large nuclear cross-section, except with one exception, except for the thermal capture type of cross-sections, which are like fission, where a neutron gets captured at room temperature, has about 1,000 barn. So this is again where the factor of about 100-ish comes around, and you do that. Oh, and it can occur at room temperature. Like fission is just like ridiculously simple in some sense compared to fusion. But what's interesting to me always, that I always, because I teach both about fission and fusion, is that this leads to some very interesting consequences. It's not just the confinement of the, like in the end, you actually, by the way, you go, oh, as an engineer, you think it's like fission, While it can occur at room temperature, I better isolate it and confine it in a proper way so that I'm actually controlling the power output, the physical assembly of the fuel and so forth. As all those things are true in fusion as well too, they just happen in a different place. in the fusion power plant. Like all of that engineering happens by definition outside of where the actual energy source is occurring, which is in the plasma. So nuclear fusion is this interesting push together basically of plasma science, because you must understand plasmas, because the medium in the end is plasma, and nuclear engineering and nuclear technology, because it has to be nuclear technology, which is actually the constructed thing that basically allows this energy source to interact with the engineering world, right? So if you look at our department, you'll see most of us have some kind of combination of training in those two things.
So what was your first foray into hands-on plasma fusion or fusion research? Was it theoretical, or did you have access to a facility where you could actually conduct small-scale experiments?
Yeah, actually, I dove right into the big one. So what it was, and this dates me, like when I was an undergraduate, they didn't let undergraduates do research. Undergraduates will break things, so we don't want them to be touching any of my expensive equipment. I probably did like a plasma lab. I probably like a Langmuir probe or something like that when I was an undergraduate. But what happened was, after I finished my engineering physics degree, I dove straight into fusion, into confinement. And what that looked like was that they had just completed the construction and commissioning of a tokamak, which is one of the primary fusion confinement concepts, just outside of Montreal. And it was interesting. It was done by something called the National Institutes for Scientific Research, Institut National de Recherche Scientifique, which is like the research arm of the University of Quebec. So it was very focused on developing it in Quebec, which is interesting because their other partner was Hydro-Quebec, which is one of the world's largest electrical utilities. And actually the device was built at the Hydro-Quebec research facility just outside of Montreal. So I just dove right in because that experiment had just started, and they were looking for graduate students. I was lucky enough to be, in fact, I would think I was literally the first student to arrive there to start working on that, and also the first student to get a PhD out of it. So I just dove right in. It's like I was already I basically started doing measurement techniques on thermonuclear plasmas like right away. So I just jumped right in. Yeah.
Oh, so that was fantastic timing,
which was really
and
fun. Yeah.
co-location.
Yeah. Again, I think it's interesting. Modern education in STEM provides so much more opportunities for undergraduates to do research. And like I tell all my undergraduates, there is no substitute for getting in a lab and going and doing research, because it's totally, while it's connected, it's an academic activity, obviously, it's totally different than solving PSATs and sitting in a classroom. You have to go experience it to understand both about whether or not it's for you and find out what your skills are in it, right? And for me, like I remember I moved a long ways away from home, and also no texting or anything like that. We had a time every Sunday that I would call my mom and dad back in Saskatchewan, because that was a big deal back then. Yes. So they put me right to work. I already started building a small instrument. It was basically an optical instrument to start measuring things about what were going on in the plasma. And I think it was probably like a month in. Like I told my mom and dad, I said, "Oh, I found it. This is what I'm going to be doing for the rest of my life, almost for sure." It's because this is what I was waiting for, right? Like, honestly, university bored me a little bit. It was like, because it wasn't piquing my interest and my curiosity, and also my activities about thinking about how do you go and do something. So that was an interesting experience for sure. And then in about a year, I published my first paper, and I actually constructed it in an experiment. It was basically something called laser ablation. It's thin film laser ablation. We use this essentially as a perturbation technique to measure what happens when you put particulate matter into the plasma and basically follow it around. It's like a tracer essentially. But what you had to do is, we realized nobody had actually quantified the atomization. So this basically, it's a short pulse, like YAG laser or something like that, hits into a thin film target, a couple microns, and technically they said, oh, and this atomizes all the particles. But I realized nobody had actually ever measured it. So I actually came up with a technique that was a new idea that I basically came up with an idea of using nuclear activation analysis. It gets complicated, but I basically came up with this new idea about how, so I built a little test stand and just characterized everything about how these particulate matter worked and published that. There was that moment too. It's like looking at the data and realizing no human being ever had actually seen that. I mean, it wasn't that big of a deal, but honestly, but that feeling of knowing, oh my God, like I'm the first person to actually see this data, interpret it, and then understand it so that other people can understand it. It's like a drug almost. It's like this feeling of discovery was very quickly that I also understood that's what I wanted.
Could you perhaps uncover some of the aspects of like research work which has been done maybe at that time or nowadays? Because tokamaks or the fusion machines, they're quite complex. So it probably takes generations of students to see what is happening. Also, I guess the environment, since it's probably, I understand, like quite big groups.